his name. That's all it took. 2 syllables spoken across a crowded hospital fundraiser ballroom, and my entire body went cold. The way it does when you step outside in January without your coat and the wind off Lake Ontario hits you before you're ready. I was standing near the silent auction tables, holding a glass of Pinot Grigio I hadn't actually wanted, making small talk with a colleague from the cardiology department, when I heard someone say his name. Not to me, just in the air, part of a conversation I wasn't in, and somehow that was worse. Ethan Goss. I hadn't said that name out loud in almost 8 years. I should back up. Because the fundraiser was just the end of a story that started long before I had the sense to see it clearly. I met Ethan in my 2nd year of nursing school at McMaster in Hamilton. He was doing his MBA, and we crossed paths at a house party in Westdale that my roommate dragged me to on a Thursday night when I had a pathophysiology midterm in 4 days. He was the kind of person who filled a room, not because he was loud, but because he had this way of looking at you like you were the only person worth talking to. I know now that was a skill he'd practiced, but at 22, I just thought I was lucky. We dated for 2 years. He was charming and ambitious, and he made me feel, for the first time in my adult life, like someone saw something remarkable in me. He used to say I was the smartest person in any room I walked into, which I believed because I wanted to, not because he'd given me any particular reason to trust his judgment. The summer before my final placement, he sat me down at the kitchen table in the apartment we'd been sharing for 8 months. The one on Hess Street with the radiator that clanked all winter and the landlord who never fixed anything, and told me he'd been accepted into a consulting position in Calgary, that he was leaving in 3 weeks, that he thought we'd both known for a while. This wasn't working. I had not known. I sat there for what felt like a very long time after he left the room, looking at a coffee mug he'd left on the counter. One of those ones from a gas station with a Canadian flag on it. Completely ordinary. I remember thinking that it was strange how a relationship could end and all the objects just stayed exactly where they were. I cried for about 2 weeks, not constantly. I had clinical hours and an OSCE evaluation and a patient simulation lab that didn't care about my personal life. So I cried in the shower and on the bus, and once, memorably, in the parking lot of a No Frills on Main Street, because a song came on my headphones that we'd listened to together on a road trip to Niagara-on-the-Lake. And then I stopped. Not because I'd processed it in any meaningful way, but because I had 4 months left in my program and I needed to graduate. I threw everything I had into those final months. My preceptor at Hamilton Health Sciences told me I had one of the strongest clinical instincts she'd seen in a student in years. I passed my NCLEX on the first attempt. I applied, almost on a whim, for a competitive graduate nursing program at the University of Toronto that I'd convinced myself I wasn't qualified for. I got in, full funding. I moved to Toronto in September, and I never looked back at Hess Street. The 8 years that followed were, honestly, good ones. Hard, in the way that building something real is always hard. My graduate program was rigorous and humbling in equal measure. I specialized in critical care and spent 3 years working in the ICU at Toronto General before transitioning into a clinical educator role. The kind where you're responsible for the training and competency of new nurses across a department where the stakes are always someone's life and the margin for error is exactly 0. I met my husband, Patrick, at a fundraiser, a different one, a smaller one at a community health center in Scarborough, where I'd volunteered to run a presentation on sepsis recognition for community physicians. He was there because he helped organize the event. He's an architect. He volunteers because he was raised by people who believed that was simply what you did. We dated for 1.5 years. He proposed at Algonquin Park on a canoe trip in the rain, because the weather had not cooperated with his plan and he'd decided to do it anyway rather than wait. That's very Patrick. He does not let inconvenient circumstances change what he's decided to do. We got married in a small ceremony outside Collingwood, near Georgian Bay, the September before last. 37 people. My parents, his family, the people who actually mattered. I should also mention our daughter. She was 4 years old at the time of the fundraiser. Her name is Bex, short for Rebecca, after Patrick's grandmother. She has his calm and, apparently, my candor, which is a combination that produces some truly startling moments. She came with us to the fundraiser because our sitter had canceled that afternoon, and the event was important to Patrick's firm, which had donated the design work for a new wing at the hospital. The plan was that Bex would sit with Patrick during the program, color in her sketchbook, and fall asleep on his shoulder before the silent auction portion. This was a plan that had worked before. I want to be clear that I hadn't thought about Ethan Goss in a very long time. Not in any real way. He'd crossed my mind the way things do when you're cleaning out an old drawer and find something you don't immediately recognize. A brief, flat moment of, oh, right. And then you close the drawer and move on. So when I heard someone say his name across that ballroom, I wasn't bracing for anything. I didn't even fully register it at first. It was just sound. And then I turned around. He was maybe 15 feet away, standing with a small cluster of people near the bar. He looked, I'll be honest, largely the same, a little older. He'd filled out, the way men do in their mid-30s. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my first month's rent in Toronto. He had the posture of a person who had spent the last 8 years being agreed with. I learned later, through the very efficient information sharing network of professional events where everyone is in some way connected to everyone else, that Ethan had done well for himself in Calgary. The consulting position had led to a partnership at a national firm. He'd moved back to Ontario 18 months ago, opened a boutique advisory practice in the financial district, was apparently on the board of the hospital foundation that had organized tonight's event. He saw me approximately 3 seconds after I saw him. I watched the recognition move across his face, the small recalibration of expression that happens when you encounter something you weren't expecting. And then, and this is the part I keep coming back to, he smiled. Not the genuine, slightly awkward smile of someone who realizes they're at the same event as an ex and is trying to be civil. Something else. Something a little too comfortable. He excused himself from his group and walked over. Vivian. He said my name like a statement, like he was confirming something to himself. I thought that was you. Ethan. I kept my voice level. Hi, you look great, he said, in the way men say things they expect to land as compliments. What are you doing in Toronto? Did you end up finishing nursing? Did you end up finishing? As if the trajectory of my career was a question he'd left open. I finished, I said. I'm a clinical educator at Toronto General now. He nodded. The way you nod when someone tells you something you're going to mentally file under, that's nice for her. Good for you, he said. That's great. There was a pause. I was about to say something perfectly cordial and then excuse myself to find Patrick when Ethan tilted his head slightly and said, with a small private smile, I always thought you'd end up doing more with that brain of yours. I held very still. More. He'd said more, as if clinical education at one of the country's largest hospitals was the consolation prize, as if the problem was that I'd aimed too low. I'm pretty happy with what I'm doing, I said. No, of course, he held up a hand. I just mean, you were always capable of so much. I used to wonder sometimes if you'd ever really push yourself. You know, I looked at him. This man who had sat across from me at a kitchen table and ended a relationship in the same tone of voice he was using now. Helpful, instructive, doing me a favor. You used to wonder, I said. Not in a bad way. He smiled again. I wanted good things for you, Vivian. I still do. I hope things have worked out the way you hoped. This was the part where I was supposed to say something, to set the record straight with the calm, precise, devastating comeback that the situation logically called for. I didn't get the chance. From somewhere to my left, I heard the very fast sound of small feet on a hardwood floor, that particular rhythm that parents learn to identify by month 18. And then a small person attached herself to my leg with the complete physical confidence of a 4-year-old who has never once doubted her welcome. Mama. Bex looked up at me. Daddy said to come get you because the auction thing is starting, and he saved you a seat, but he also says, if you don't come soon, someone else is going to bid on the painting you liked. I looked down at her. She was wearing a navy dress and a headband with a small bow, and she had Patrick's architectural grade seriousness in her expression. Tell Daddy I'm on my way, I said. She didn't move. She turned her gaze, unhurriedly, with the thoroughness of a child who notices everything. To Ethan, he had gone a little quiet. Who's that? She said. Someone Mama knew a long time ago, I said. She considered this. Before Daddy? Yes. She looked at Ethan with the completely open assessment that small children perform without any awareness of social convention, and then she said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone reporting the weather, you have the same face as the man in the parking lot who was mean to Grandma. There was a silence. I genuinely did not know what parking lot she was referring to. I still don't. Children that age carry detailed internal records of every perceived injustice they have ever witnessed, and they surface them at unexpected times. Ethan's expression had shifted. The pleasant, slightly condescending composure had gone somewhere. He looked uncertain in a way he hadn't a moment ago. Bex, I said, go tell Daddy I'm coming. She looked at Ethan one more time. Then, with the decisive energy of a child who has completed a task, she turned and trotted back in the direction she'd come from. The silence she left behind was a different kind than the one before. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, said, finally, She's yours? She is. And your husband is here tonight? He is. Something moved across his face that I can only describe as a quiet reassessment, like he'd walked into a room expecting it to be empty and found furniture. You should get back, he said. To the auction. I should. I agreed. I picked up my glass. I turned and walked in the direction of the auction tables, toward the far side of the room where I could already see Patrick standing near a framed landscape print, holding a bidding paddle and looking in my direction. He raised an eyebrow when I reached him. The one that means everything okay? I took his hand. There's a painting, I said. There is, he said. Do you want to bid on it? I do. He squeezed my hand once and turned to face the auction table, and that was that. I spent a lot of years after Hamilton wondering if the problem had been me, if I'd been too much of something or not enough of something else. If there had been signs I'd missed, or patterns I'd repeated, or some fundamental miscalibration in how I understood my own worth. I know now that those questions were reasonable, that most people ask them after something ends, but that I'd aimed them at the wrong target. The problem wasn't me. The problem was that I'd spent 2 years taking the word of someone who saw capable as something to be rationed, as a quality that needed his direction to become useful, who could sit across from a person and tell her she was brilliant while quietly constructing a ceiling directly above her head. The night of the fundraiser, lying in bed with Patrick, asleep beside me, and Bex down the hall and the city quiet outside the window, I thought about the expression on Ethan's face when Bex appeared. Not the parking lot comment, though, honestly. That was something. But the moment just before, when he'd heard small feet on the floor and turned to see who was coming. That small flinch of recalibration. The way the entire architecture of the conversation had shifted. He'd come over to that auction table expecting to be the most impressive person in my orbit, and what he found instead was just my life, my actual life, which had nothing to do with his assessment of my potential, which had been built without his involvement or his approval, which had turned out, against all his quiet predictions, to be exactly enough. Patrick hadn't said a single word to Ethan. He hadn't needed to. He'd just been there, holding a bidding paddle, waiting for me. Bex, when I tucked her in that night, was already half asleep. I asked her, quietly, about the parking lot man. She blinked at me. What man? The one you told that person about. The man who was mean to Grandma. She thought about it, shook her head slowly. I don't know, she said, with complete serenity, and closed her eyes. I sat on the edge of her bed for a minute in the dark. A 4-year-old had walked into that conversation and, without knowing anything about it, had said the exact right thing at the exact right moment. Not because she'd understood what was happening, but simply because she is entirely, uncomplicatedly herself. She doesn't calibrate what she says based on what someone needs to hear. She just tells the truth as she sees it, immediately, and then moves on. I could learn something from that. I kissed her forehead and turned off the lamp and went to bed. We won the painting, by the way. It's a view of the Scarborough Bluffs, oil on canvas, autumn light on the water. It's hanging in our front hallway now, and I walk past it every morning on my way to work, and I think it's one of the nicest things in our house. Patrick paid $40 more than the next highest bidder, which is probably $15 more than he needed to, but that's also very Patrick. And sometimes, when I walk past it, I think about how strange it is that you can spend years worrying about what someone thought of you, years carrying the weight of their quietly stated disappointment. And then one evening, across a crowded room, you realize the weight is gone. You don't know exactly when you put it down. You just notice one day that your hands are free.